Hello, and welcome to Scientific Principles of Psychology, by the way. This isn't generic hard scientific principles. It's how we apply science in psychology. I just wanted to give you a little heads up that this series of lectures was designed for my students. So if you are a student from another school or just a person who's interested in scientific principles, things like that, I welcome you to listening to my lectures, but please know that they were designed for my students and for the concepts that we really want to stress in our program. The other thing I wanted to say to my students is that I've had comments in the past about the production value of my online lectures, and I just wanted to address that really quickly. I am recording these lectures myself. I don't have any help from the media department or anything. I'm a psychology professor. I'm not a video person. Just because I have a YouTube channel doesn't mean I'm a YouTuber. And so I'm doing the best that I can. I have a microphone that should reduce the pops. I'm actually using a bone-conducted microphone to help with that. I'm not putting my face in these videos to help with the ability to view these videos with even a poor internet connection, which a lot of us have in the area where I'm teaching. I will periodically do some live things in these lectures, so you will ultimately have some movement going on in these lectures. But I just wanted to give you a little heads up that if there's noise in the background, I'm not going to stop and re-record my entire lecture. I'm doing the best I can. And my time is valuable, so I'm not gonna re-record and re-record these lectures. You should think about them as if you were sitting in a classroom. And if the grounds crew was out mowing the lawn while I was lecturing, we'd have to deal with it. And so that's the mindset I'm taking. I used to try and record and re-record until it sounded perfect, but it was taking me forever. So I'm just going to try and convey information. You're going to have to tolerate the fact that there might be a dog barking or a heater going right now. I can hear the heat pump, for example, right now outside. You might be picking that up. So just beware. And I'm not going to say this ever in any other chapters. So if you have forgotten, by the time we get to chapter 10, please remember I'm a psychology professor and not a media producer. All right. So that is my little warning about the possibility that these may not be the smoothest of all YouTube videos that you've ever watched. Okay. So now let's get to content. Chapter 1 covers, of the textbook that we're using, covers the current state of psychology. So what I wanted to do is start you off with a thought exercise. I want you to think of a psychologist, and in fact what I'd like you to do is try and think of whomever you would consider the most influential psychologist of the 20th century. So think back to historical psychologists and think about who had the biggest impact on the field of psychology. I'm literally hoping that you're thinking of someone. In my classes, I pass out little slips of paper and I ask students to actually write it down so we can take a tally of what they write down, but clearly we can't do that in this scenario. So I just want you to mentally think of someone who is an influential psychologist. It might even help if I told you, think of the first person who came to mind when you thought of a famous psychologist. Now, based on my face-to-face classes, most people write down Freud for their answer to this question. So if you wrote down Freud, you'd be in good company. Probably 90% of my face-to-face students write down Freud. When I teach intro to psych, everyone has heard of Freud. Like if I ask students, have you heard of this person or have you heard of that person? Every hand goes up when I ask whether they've heard of Freud. So if you wrote down Freud, you'd be in really good company. Research was done to answer the question of who could be named the most influential psychologist of the 20th century. Researchers from the Association for Psychological Science sent out questionnaires to department chairs from 250 psychology programs around the United States. And they were asked who was the most influential psychologist of the 20th century. In addition to that, so that was just sort of like a vote, maybe you might even argue a popularity contest. In addition to that data, the researchers looked at number of publications produced by different psychologists in the 20th century. They looked at a real marker of the influence of a scientist, which was how many times a publication was cited by other researchers. So that implies that the original paper was influencing the people who were citing that paper. So they looked at productivity of the scientist and then the effect that the scientist was having on other scientists by way of how many times they were cited. And then the third thing that they looked at was whether the person's name has become what we call an eponym. That is, we start to use the name as if it's a noun or an adjective. So taking that into consideration, this is the list that the researchers constructed. So the top 20 psychologists of the 20th century. Number 1 was B.F. Skinner, 2 was Piaget, 3 was Sigmund Freud. So you've probably heard of all 3 of those researchers. You might have heard of Albert Bandura. Some of these you might remember better if I give you a little bit of a reminder who they were. B.F. Skinner was the one with the operant conditioning with the rats and the pigeons. Piaget is the one who developed the theory of development for cognitive development for children up to puberty. Sigmund Freud, which I'm assuming you know who he is, and we're going to talk about him a little bit more. Albert Bandura is the one who did the Bobo doll studies and discovered that when kids watch an adult beat up an inflatable clown doll, they mimic a lot of the same behaviors that they saw the adult do. Now we start to get into some people who you might not necessarily remember. Fessinger. Fessinger was a learning theorist. Carl Rogers, you might remember, he was a humanistic psychologist. Schachter is actually still alive. So he's a memory researcher, and he had a huge impact on the field of memory. Miller, Thorndike, Abraham Maslow, you might know him from his theories of motivation. So as we go down this list, you might remember Gordon Allport. He was a personality theorist. Erik Erikson, he had a developmental theory that involved crises that you might confront at different stages of your life. I think was a personality theorist. William James is credited with being the founder of American psychology, so we probably should know his name. So we go through this list, right? You might remember some of these people, not others. But why does everybody know who Freud is? That's really the question. Why is he considered one of the top 3 psychologists of the 20th century? And I'm bringing this up for a very important reason. So ride out with me to the end of this discussion of Freud, and I think you'll understand why I'm bringing it up. He's one of the top 3 as measured by that research study that I described. But why is he a poor example of a psychologist? I mean, what's wrong with him being in the top 3? What's wrong with everybody knowing his name? Well, number one, and probably most importantly, he's not a psychologist. But I think that's a really good reason to not be considered a great example of a psychologist. He was a psychiatrist. He was trained as a medical doctor, and he took a very biological approach to explaining behaviors. He did add in the role of environment, so we'll give him credit for that. But he was not a psychologist. He never called himself a psychologist. He started doing his work long before the field of psychology was even discovered. So he was not a psychologist. He did not do any kind of scientific assessment of any of the theories that he generated. He did not do any experiments to test the things he was claiming. Now, in his defense, how would you do a controlled experiment to determine whether parenting leads to an Oedipal complex? I mean, like, how would you even do that? So maybe he wanted to do controlled experiments and realized that the things that he was studying he couldn't. But the fact is, there's no like experimental data to support the things he claims. He never did any direct observations of the things that his patients told him. His patients would tell him about things that they remember from their childhood or from their dreams or whatever, and there was no way for him to independently verify that those reports were accurate. So without that kind of direct observation, that confirmation of the claims that the people were making, there's no way that we could actually say that this was a scientific endeavor. I mean, in a lot of fields of psychology, we don't do controlled experiments where we have all the variables under our own control, but we do direct observations, and he did not have that. He developed, one of the reasons why he is famous is because he developed a grand theory, and for us in psychology, the implications were biggest on personality theory. He had this grand theory of how our personalities develop from birth into adulthood, He had a theory that explained how inadequacies in our childhood could cause quirks in our adult behavior or maybe neuroses in our adult behavior. His theory incorporated what healthy personality looked like versus what unhealthy personality looked like, which brings us to the grand theory that he had about the origins of psychological disorders. He had the same explanation for the origin of every single psychological disorder. There was no variation in his explanation. It was always about bad parenting. It was always about, your needs being unmet. That could cause everything from depression and anxiety all the way up to schizophrenia. So he had these grand theories that explained things that are very important to us in psychology, but he really didn't have data to support those things. He had case study data, and that's it. And case studies are a valid way of starting to explore a question, but the next thing we do is move on to direct observations, correlational studies, controlled experiments, where we try and get more and more certain that our interpretations are accurate. And he never moved past just the self-report case study design. So what we could say is that basically he provided a philosophy rather than a science. He gave us a way of looking at personality, a way of looking at disorder, but he didn't do it through a scientific lens. So how did he make it to the top three? Well, first off, like I said, he developed these grand theories, and so a lot of researchers have spent their lives trying to support or refute the things that he said in that theory. Most researchers have spent their time trying to refute it because that's how science runs, but that's basically how he got so many citations, is that so many people were testing out the claims that he made in his theory. So while he didn't provide data to support his theory, other researchers have collected data that have had implications for our understanding of the accuracy of his theory. A lot of people assume that Freudian theory has all been thrown out, and we all know that it's fake or wrong. And it turns out that a lot of data has actually provided some evidence that he might not have been as wrong as we would like him to be, especially for things like the origin of slips of the tongue and things like that. So researchers have spent a lot of time trying to test his claims, and therefore he has received a lot of citations, right? So if we're going to use one of the measures, not only how much did the individual publish themselves, but how often those publications got cited by other researchers, well, he's going to score really high because a lot of researchers have tested his claims. The other way that he scored high is that we say things like Freudian slip. We say things like Freudian theory, right? His name has become an eponym. And so for that, he got high marks. And then the other way that he got high marks is that there are department chairs who said, whether this guy's a psychologist or not, whether what he did is scientific or not, I have to admit he's had a huge influence on psychological thinking in the 20th century. So he got a lot of department chair votes because of that. It might not have even been close to their field of psychology, but they had to acknowledge that he's had a big influence on the field. Okay, so while he is probably not a very good example of a psychologist for the reasons that I've outlined, you can see why he scored as high as he did. Now, the other reason why he scores really high and why probably all of my students who may not even be psychology majors have heard of Freud is that the humanities really like Freud. Humanities include things like history and media and other things where we're looking, English oftentimes is in the humanities where we're looking at themes and stories and stuff like that. When you look at Freudian theory through the lens of the humanities, it's a very attractive theory. And so I thought I'd share with you a couple of examples of why. For one reason, here we have a nice example from a play, right? Dream interpretation. Mr. Scrooge, I think we should talk a bit more about this dream you had, right? The idea that a person's dreams could say something about their real motives or what's lacking in their personality or something like that. In fact, just before I started this lecture, I was listening to a book on tape, and one of the key plot lines right now is trying to make sense of why this person is dreaming the things that this person's dreaming. Like, what does this mean that this person's having these recurring dreams? That's very Freudian, to think that you could be walking through your life having, your views and your, desires and motivations and all the things that you think are what's really motivating you, and then your dream could tell you what you're really motivated by. Like, that's very Freudian to think that. And so, to have these things pop up in stories and plays and movies and historical interpretations about, people's behaviors from the old days, things like that, that's very Freudian. Slips of the tongue. Here we have a speaker giving a talk at the Big is Beautiful conference, and he goes a little off script and says, wow, heavy turnout, right? These kinds of slips of the tongue when you say one thing when you mean another. These slips of the tongue, what we call Freudian slips, are another example of where we think that you accidentally said what you really meant. What's really dwelling in your unconscious will come out in the form of a slip of the tongue. And a lot of people think that's true. We extend it, in fact, to, and by a lot of people, I mean, lay people. We actually extend it to when people drink too much, and then they say things, and we actually even have a phrase for it in vino veritas, right? In wine is truth, right? That when you drink, you start saying the truth. And that's very Freudian, to think that maybe in our everyday life we can censor ourselves and present ourselves in a way that we think is desirable, and then in drunkenness or when we are nervous or other things that might generate slips of the tongue, we would reveal what we really think, right? So that's very Freudian, and it makes for a good plot line. It makes for really a good armchair interpretation of other people's behaviors, things like that. The idea that we were shaped by our parents to become the way that we are. Here we have Mr. Oedipus, and in the olden days of the 1950s, there was a TV show called Mr. Ed, where the horse could talk to his human, and so here we have Mr. Oedipus, and he's, I really love my mom, right? If you're at all familiar with Freudian theory, supposedly little boys go through a phase where they fall in love with their mothers and want to murder their fathers. This idea that things that happen to us in our childhood have these big implications for our adult behaviors. It really, I think we all kind of just assume that's true, right? That parental malpractice, some researchers call it, the idea that our parents didn't satisfy our needs fully, and so now as adults, now we overeat, or we talk too much, or we drink too much, or these other things that would tie back to Freudian stages, fixations, he called them. I would just like to throw out, our parents are just humans, and so of course there's always going to be malpractice when humans are involved, right? And so to be able to say, oh, well, that's because your parents did something wrong, kind of lets us off the hook. So it is an attractive interpretation. It's not, well, I wouldn't want to behave like this, but gosh, I was conditioned to behave like this by my parents, right? It makes a lot of sense, and makes it so that we're not necessarily responsible. So it's very attractive, and it makes really good plot lines. I mean, you can imagine like the old movie Psycho, where Norman Bates' mom was very abusive to him, and all sorts of bad things were happening. So that's why, as an adult, he murders the people who come and stay at the Bates Motel, right? I mean, obviously, mom caused it. Or a more modern example might be from the movie Joker, which I'll confess right now I haven't seen, but so I can't possibly ruin the plot for you. All I know is what I've heard. But from what I heard, that's the basic plot of Joker, is that bad parenting or bad experiences with his peers cause this behavior as an adult. Archetypes. This was something that was introduced by a follower of Freud, Carl Jung. And Jung said that in our human collective unconscious, which is a separate kind of unconscious from what Freud designed, Jung thought that we inherited a collection of unconscious motives, memories, impulses that all humans share. So, for example, here we have, in the U.S., we have something called Superman. Well, in another culture, they have their version. In this case, he's labeled Super Duper Man. In reality, there are Supermen in just about every culture. There's Hercules, right? There's, well, I'm thinking of not the best example. In Japan, there's a anime that has a character called One Punch Man, right? This idea that you can save people, and that there will be somebody who can step up and save all of us from this bad thing happening. That's what Jung would consider an archetype, that all cultures have it. And that means that it was part of our collective unconscious. imagine, I mean, like that is the root of just about every plot line, to have some kind of archetypal character. You have the archetypal mom, right, who behaves in these certain ways that we all kind of vaguely know what they must be because we all share this archetype. There's the archetypal, sociopath. I was just talking about the Joker, right, or Norman Bates. We could be talking about an archetypal bad guy, right? We could be talking about a lot of different things, and we would all kind of know what it means when we say Superman. We all kind of know what that means, no matter what culture you came from. And so the humanities like that, people who generate plot lines and things like that because it gives us a place to start from where everybody has like shared knowledge. Complexes are something that were introduced by another follower of Freud named Adler. And in fact, the first one that he generated was something called an inferiority complex, where he argued that as little children, when we really were small and we really were inferior, if we weren't parented in the correct way or we didn't have the correct kinds of successful experiences, as we got older, we may carry with us an inferiority complex where we feel inferior even though we shouldn't be feeling that way anymore. So here we have this cartoon, an inferiority complex. Is that the best problem you can come up with, right? Because he's so inferior, he can't even come up with a good complex to have. But imagine, this is a great plot line also. I mean, think about like the historical interpretation of Napoleon has been that he was short, and so he was trying to compensate for that by taking over countries and things like that. I recently read an article that said that the measurements that they used back in the old days were different from the ones that we have, or that the French measurements were different than the English measurements or something, and that in actuality he was more like 5'7", which at that time didn't actually qualify as short. So I don't even know if Napoleon was short, let alone had a complex about being short. But imagine what a great story that is, right? Think about, looking back on historical behavior and you go, well, why would he be such a megalomaniac? Oh, he was trying to overcompensate, which is a Freudian term, for the fact that he was so short, and he had this complex about being so short, right? Like, you can see how it's just an easy interpretation. And then I'll give my final interpretation of why Freudian theory is so popular. I mean, I think this is why he got attention in the first place. I really do. That early on, he had this emphasis on sex. It's just runs through his entire theory. And so the idea that people could kind of get a little bit titillated even by reading his theories or reading his books or listening to his speeches, it's kind of attractive, right? And so that might be what got him famous in the first place, because he kept thinking that everything went back to erogenous zones and eroticism and things like that. So you can kind of see why the humanities really liked Freud, and why his theories had such a big impact on our culture, which is another really big measure of the influence of a theorist. So hopefully I've kind of made the case for why he's not a great example, but also made a really good case for why so many of you might have had him as your first thought. I don't think there's anything wrong with him being our first thought, but we're going to talk about other ways to think about behavior and stuff. So let's talk about other ways. Science versus philosophy. Now, some of you have probably had philosophy classes and would be able to answer my questions for me if I were in a classroom and asked you to offer answers. But I'll just go ahead and answer them for us. If you had a question that you wanted answered, let's say if a tree fell in the forest and there was no one there to hear it, would it make a noise? Okay, classic philosophical question, right? If you were a philosopher, your method of answering that question would be to use logic, right? And I don't know if you guys have had philosophy. I took intro to philosophy when I was a student, and I got to read the arguments for and against the tree making a noise. And the logic for why it made a noise was that noise is simply the moving of molecules in sound waves, and so those molecules are going to move no matter whether there's a perceiver there or not, and therefore there was a noise, and it's independent of whether there's a perceiver. Others argued, well, without a perceiver, for those sound waves to land on their eardrums, then how could there really be a noise? All there was movement of the molecules. And then on the other side, they say, well, I mean, there's always animals in the forest, so they had to have heard it. And then the comeback is, but you don't know what their experience is. And so back and forth, and really with no evidence or anything, just using logic. And that's really characteristic of philosophy. But I have to say, philosophy developed the roots and the strategies that ultimately led to scientific reasoning. For example, philosophy offered an interpretation of logic that said, really, we should rely on direct observation more than just pure logic. This way of thinking is called empiricism. Go out into the world and make an observation. Now, with the tree falling in the forest argument, we can't really do that, can we? Because if the tree falls in the forest and I'm here to hear it as an observer, well, then by definition, we didn't answer the question of what happens if there is no observer. So it's a bit of a circle. Can't do direct empiricism on that particular question. Modern thinkers say, why don't we put a recording device out there? And then I guess a philosopher could argue, and maybe they have, well, then you've put a perceiver out there. It's just a delayed perceiver. Oh my gosh, my son made me watch a video about quantum physics, and it was talking about how the presence of another atom actually changes the behavior of the existing atom. And I might not be even saying it right. It might not have been atoms. It might have been like protons. So I don't even know what to say about direct observation if the act of a particular atom or proton being there could affect the action of the other proton. And I don't even know what to say about that. I'm a psychologist, not a physicist. So I'm just going to go, I am aware of quantum physics. And I'm just going to go back with, direct observation being a little bit less microscopic. Let's go with that. So empiricism is that philosophical principle that says we should rely on our direct observations. Now, when we moved into systematic empiricism, we really took a giant leap away from philosophy and into science, where we say, okay, you know what, instead of just collecting information out in the world through our senses, right, through our direct observations, let's make a theory or hypothesis, right? Let's take a theory. If there's no one there to hear it, there won't be a sound. Let's generate a hypothesis regarding that, and then test that hypothesis and see whether it is supported or refuted. So in systematic empiricism, we make our prediction before we make our observation. All right. So with that, science takes a step away from pure logic and just saying, well, it must be this way because this is what I think. And part of the reason why science took a step away from just regular empiricism and said, let's do it systematically, is that in regular empiricism, we are relying on our own direct observations to make our case. Now, think about this from psychology's perspective. This is a really important thing to think about psychology as a special case of science, because in psychology, we're studying human behaviors and mental processes. So if I rely as a scientist solely on those things that I can directly observe, first off, that's going to have an impact on what I can study. If you think back to early psychology when we were behaviorists, that was the premise in behaviorism. We can only study that which we can directly observe. And so we had a lot of rat research, pigeon research, flatworm research, where we were providing a stimulus and then looking for the response that was directly observable. So if we're going to say I can only study the things that I can directly observe, I'm only going to be able to study certain kinds of things. I'm not going to be able to study what's going on inside a person's head, like memory. I'm not going to be able to study things like love, which happen inside a person's head or heart or guts or wherever love happens. Unless it's directly observable, I wouldn't be able to study it if I had to do purely empiricism. So for one thing, psychology we don't want to anymore study just pure direct observation. The other thing about systematic empiricism that makes it really super important that psychology follows that method is that if I only study that which I can directly observe, I can only study the people who I have access to. Right? I can only study the people who come to my lab or who are part of my direct sphere of influence, things like that. And so I'm going to have limited observations as I go through the world. Whereas with systematic empiricism, I could directly recruit different kinds of people into my lab. I could directly recruit different people to participate in my online survey in modern methods, right? With systematic empiricism, we say to ourselves, if I want to make a test of what, let's say, American women think, I can't just study the 4 American women who I directly know, right? I have to study a cross-section. And how am I going to do that? I have to do it very deliberately. I have to recruit certain kinds of people into my study to make sure that I'm getting a good sample. So empiricism says, well, only believe your eyes, ears, touch. Only believe that. Systematic empiricism says, make a prediction first. And if your prediction is broad enough, you're going to need to deliberately, on purpose, make sure that you're studying the right kinds of people to make sure that happens. So in psychology, in particular, we can't just find any old tree in any old forest and test the hypothesis that it makes a noise or not when it falls. We have to find different kinds of people because people vary in their responses to stimuli and they vary in their attitudes and all sorts of things. So that's a really important difference between psychology and some other sciences with regard to our ability to just purely rely on our direct observation. I'd like to point out one other thing that I'll probably bring up later in class, and that's the fact that our direct observations may not be accurate. So with pure empiricism, if we say, I'm going to walk through life and I'm only going to believe that which I see with my own eyes. I was just watching a TV show where they went to a sort of seance thing. And, it's dark, they've got candles on, and they heard noises behind them, and they really believed that a ghost had come into the room. They really believed it. Their direct observation was that they experienced a ghost. They might have, I don't know. Science has not established whether there really are ghosts or not, right? But their direct observation does not make it true, right? The fact that their experience of the situation was that was a ghost does not necessarily make it true that that was a ghost. With systematic empiricism, we would say, okay, we're going to test the hypothesis that there are ghosts in this building, and we're going to set up tests that would allow us to support or refute the hypothesis that there are ghosts present. So our direct observations may be limited, and our direct observations might be biased. They might be wrong. And so in particular with psychology, if we're going to try to explain people's behaviors and mental processes, we have got to follow systematic empiricism, where we make a prediction first, and then we test that hypothesis. Okay, I'm going to stop here. My next video is going to be a series of hypothesis tests. So hang on tight. We're going to do a little live hypothesis testing in the next video.